If your spiritual awakening feels like you're being torn apart from the inside out, if every day feels like drowning in an ocean of emotions you can't name, if you've lost everything that once made sense and now wonder if you're losing your mind, you're not broken. You're not doing it wrong. And you're definitely not alone. What you're experiencing has a name, a purpose, and most importantly, an end. But before I explain why your awakening feels like hell, I need you to understand something that will change how you see this entire process. Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." What Jung understood, and what modern spirituality often fails to mention, is that awakening isn't about ascending into bliss. It's about descending into truth. And truth, real truth, burns everything that isn't authentic. Today, I'm going to show you exactly why your spiritual awakening feels like hell, what's really happening in your psyche during this process, and most importantly, how to navigate through this sacred fire without losing yourself completely. If you've been wondering whether the pain you're feeling is normal, whether you'll ever feel whole again, or if there's light at the end of this tunnel, stay with me. And if this video speaks to your soul, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support helps me create more content for souls who are brave enough to face their deepest truths. Here's what nobody tells you about spiritual awakening. It's not a graduation into permanent peace. It's a demolition project. And like any demolition, it gets messy, loud, and terrifying before anything beautiful can be built. The spiritual community has sold you a lie. They've painted awakening as this beautiful, Instagram-worthy journey of meditation cushions, crystals, and endless bliss. But that's not awakening. That's spiritual materialism. Real awakening, the kind Jung wrote about, the kind that actually transforms you, feels like dying while you're still alive. Let me tell you about Sarah. She was 45, a successful marketing executive, married with 2 kids, living what everyone would call the dream. Then it started. A deep, inexplicable emptiness that no amount of success could fill. She'd wake up at 3 a.m. with this crushing weight on her chest, feeling like she was suffocating in her own life. Everything that once brought her joy now felt hollow. Her career felt meaningless. Her relationships felt superficial. Even her hobbies felt forced. Sarah thought she was having a breakdown. Her doctor suggested antidepressants. Her family told her to count her blessings. But what Sarah was experiencing wasn't depression in the clinical sense. It was what Jung called the dark night of the soul. The psyche's way of forcing a confrontation with parts of herself she'd been ignoring for decades. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of your personality, including the parts you've rejected, denied, or hidden. But here's the catch. You can't integrate what you refuse to see. And your unconscious mind will create increasingly uncomfortable circumstances until you're forced to look. The discomfort you're feeling isn't a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that you're finally ready to become whole. But wholeness isn't comfortable. Wholeness means accepting the parts of yourself that don't fit the image you've been trying to maintain. It means grieving the person you thought you were supposed to be, so you can become who you actually are. This process activates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort you feel when your beliefs, values, and reality no longer align. Your mind has been operating on one set of assumptions about who you are and what life means, and suddenly those assumptions are crumbling. Your brain doesn't know how to process this, so it creates anxiety, depression, confusion, and what feels like existential terror. But here's what Sarah discovered, and what you need to know. The hell you're experiencing isn't punishment, it's purification. Every uncomfortable emotion, every sleepless night, every moment of feeling lost is your psyche burning away everything that isn't authentically you. The pain isn't the problem, the pain is the solution. Jung understood that consciousness comes with a price. When you start to see through the illusions you've been living, when you recognize the masks you've been wearing, when you feel the gap between your true self and the role you've been playing, it creates what he called a moral conflict of the most painful kind. You're not losing your mind, you're finding your soul. But first, you have to lose everything that isn't really you. If you feel like you're dying during your spiritual awakening, It's because part of you actually is. Not your body, not your essence, but your ego. The constructed identity you've spent your entire life building and defending. And the ego doesn't go quietly. The ego is like a protective shell that develops around your true self during childhood. It learns what's safe, what gets love, what brings approval, and what avoids pain. Over time, this shell becomes so thick, so reinforced with other people's expectations and societal conditioning, that you forget there's anything underneath it. You mistake the shell for yourself. But during spiritual awakening, something deeper starts stirring. Jung called this the self with a capital S, your authentic, unconditioned essence. As the self begins to emerge, it creates cracks in the ego's armor. And the ego, sensing its dissolution, goes into full panic mode. This is why you might be experiencing what feels like a complete identity crisis. You wake up and don't recognize the person in the mirror. Your goals feel foreign. Your relationships feel superficial. Your job feels like you're playing a character in someone else's story, because in many ways, you were. Neuroscientist Dr. Rick Hanson's research shows that our sense of self is largely constructed by neural pathways that form through repetition and reinforcement. When those pathways start dissolving, which is exactly what happens during awakening, the brain experiences it as a literal threat to survival. Your nervous system activates the same stress response it would if you were being chased by a predator. But here's the paradox. The more you resist this dissolution, the more painful it becomes. The ego's last-ditch effort to maintain control creates what Jung called inflation, where you either become grandiose, thinking you're specially chosen or enlightened, or completely deflated, feeling like you're going crazy or broken. Both are defenses against the fundamental terror of not knowing who you are. I want you to understand something crucial. This death you're experiencing is not destruction. It's metamorphosis. Think about what happens to a caterpillar in the cocoon. Its entire body literally dissolves into what scientists call imaginal soup, before reorganizing into a butterfly. During that dissolution phase, if you opened the cocoon, you wouldn't find a butterfly in progress. You'd find nothing recognizable at all. That's where you are right now, in the imaginal soup phase of your own transformation. The ancient Greeks had a concept called kenosis, a voluntary emptying of self. In spiritual traditions around the world, this phase is recognized as necessary and sacred. The mystics called it the Great Death. The shamans called it dismemberment. Jung called it the night sea journey. But modern psychology offers us practical tools for navigating this phase. One of the most powerful is what mindfulness teacher Jon Kabat-Zinn calls non-judgmental awareness. Instead of fighting the dissolution, you learn to observe it with curiosity rather than terror. Here's a simple but profound practice. When you wake up feeling like you don't know who you are, instead of panicking, try whispering, "I don't know who I am, and that's okay." Instead of grasping for your old identity, breathe into the emptiness. Instead of filling the void with distractions, sit with it like you would sit with a friend who's grieving. The Stoic philosophers, particularly Marcus Aurelius, taught that suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our resistance to what happens to us. When you stop fighting the ego death and start surrendering to it, something miraculous occurs. The dying becomes less terrifying because you realize that what's dying was never really you anyway. You were never your job title. You were never your relationship status. You were never your achievements or failures. You were never the image you tried to maintain or the role you learned to play. Those were just costumes you wore, and now it's time to take them off. What remains when all the costumes are gone? That's what you're about to discover. Here's where spiritual awakening gets really uncomfortable and why most people turn back. You're forced to meet your shadow. Not as an enemy to defeat, but as an exiled part of yourself begging to come home. Carl Jung spent decades studying what he called the shadow, all the parts of your personality that you've deemed unacceptable, shameful, or dangerous. These aren't necessarily bad parts. They're often just inconvenient parts. Maybe it's your anger in a family that prized being nice. Maybe it's your neediness in a culture that worships independence. Maybe it's your wildness in a world that rewards conformity. Whatever you rejected about yourself didn't disappear. It went underground, into what Jung called the personal unconscious. And during spiritual awakening, the barriers between conscious and unconscious become permeable. Suddenly, all those rejected parts start surfacing, demanding attention. Let me tell you about Miguel. He was 52, a respected teacher and meditation practitioner who'd spent years cultivating what he thought was spiritual detachment. He prided himself on being calm, centered, and above lower emotions like anger or jealousy. Then his awakening began, and suddenly he was flooded with rage. Not at anyone in particular, but at everything. At the years he'd wasted being nice. At the dreams he'd abandoned to meet others' expectations. At the authentic conversations he'd avoided to keep the peace. Miguel's first instinct was to suppress this anger, to meditate it away, to spiritually bypass it with forgiveness and love and light. But the anger only grew stronger. It started affecting his sleep, his relationships, his work. He began to think he was moving backward spiritually, that he was failing at awakening. But what Miguel was experiencing wasn't failure. It was integration. The anger wasn't random or destructive. It was his inner warrior, the part of him that knew how to say no, how to protect his boundaries, how to fight for what mattered. He'd spent so many years being the good guy that he'd completely disconnected from his ability to assert himself authentically. This is what Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Your shadow contains not just your rejected pain, but your rejected power. The parts of you that you've been afraid to own often contain exactly the medicine you need for this next phase of your life. The shadow integration process isn't about acting out every impulse or emotion. It's about acknowledging and accepting these parts so they stop controlling you from the unconscious. When you deny your anger, it leaks out as passive aggression. When you deny your neediness, it becomes desperate people-pleasing. When you deny your sexuality, it becomes shame or compulsion. But when you turn toward these parts with curiosity and compassion, something miraculous happens. They transform from destructive forces into creative ones. Your anger becomes healthy assertion. Your neediness becomes authentic vulnerability. Your wildness becomes creative expression. Modern psychology calls this emotional integration, and research by Dr. Dan Siegel shows that people who can acknowledge and accept their full emotional range are more resilient, more creative, and more capable of authentic intimacy. Here's a powerful shadow work exercise that Jung himself used: dialoguing with your rejected parts. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, anger, jealousy, fear, shame, instead of trying to get rid of it, try talking to it. Ask it, "What are you trying to tell me? What do you need? How long have you been waiting for me to listen?" Write down the conversation. Let the emotions speak first, without censoring or judging. You might be surprised by what emerges. Often these rejected parts carry wisdom that your conscious mind has forgotten. They remember your deepest values, your authentic desires, your core truth. The goal isn't to eliminate the shadow. As Jung said, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. The goal is to consciously relate to it, to stop projecting it onto others, and to integrate its energy in healthy ways. This is why your awakening feels like hell. You're not just meeting your light, you're meeting your darkness. And until you can embrace both, until you can say yes to your whole self, you'll remain fragmented, at war with yourself, projecting your rejected parts onto everyone around you. The shadow work phase of awakening isn't comfortable, but it's liberating. Because when you stop running from parts of yourself, when you stop trying to be perfectly spiritual or perpetually positive, you become authentic. And authenticity, even messy authenticity, is magnetic in a way that perfection never could be. There comes a moment in every authentic spiritual awakening when something shifts. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but like the first breath after being underwater too long. The hell doesn't disappear, but your relationship to it transforms. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it. You stop asking, "When will this suffering end?" and start asking, "What is this suffering teaching me?" You stop trying to get back to who you were and start getting curious about who you're becoming. This shift in perspective changes everything. This transformation aligns perfectly with what psychologists call self-determination theory, developed by researchers Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. They discovered that psychological well-being depends on three basic needs: autonomy, feeling volitional and self-directed; competence, feeling effective and capable; and relatedness, feeling connected and belonging. During the hell phase of awakening, all three of these needs feel threatened. You don't feel autonomous because you don't know who you are. You don't feel competent because nothing you used to be good at feels meaningful anymore. You don't feel related because you've outgrown your old connections but haven't yet found your new tribe. But as you move through the shadow work, as you stop fighting the ego death, as you start accepting your whole self, these needs begin to be met in entirely new ways. You develop what psychologist Viktor Frankl called self-transcendence, the ability to find meaning not in getting what you want, but in becoming who you're meant to be. Your autonomy is no longer dependent on external circumstances. It comes from an inner compass that you finally learn to trust. Your competence is no longer measured by society's standards, but by your ability to show up authentically, to stay present with whatever arises, to love yourself through the mess. Your relatedness is no longer based on performing a role but on sharing your truth and attracting people who can meet you there. Let me share a simple but powerful ritual that many of my viewers have found transformative during this rebirth phase. It's called the liberation ceremony, and it's based on ancient rites of passage that honored the death and rebirth process. Create a sacred space in your home. Light a candle. Write down on separate pieces of paper all the identities, beliefs, and patterns that you're ready to release. Don't just write the negative ones. Include the positive identities that have become too small for you. The good daughter. The successful businessman. The spiritual person. Whatever roles you've been playing that no longer fit. As you burn each piece of paper, say, "I honor how this served me, and I release it with love." Feel the grief. Feel the gratitude. Feel the fear and the freedom mixing together in your chest. Then, on a new piece of paper, write, "I am ready to discover who I am beyond all roles, beyond all identities, beyond all limitations." Keep this paper. Put it somewhere you'll see it daily. This ceremony doesn't magically end the awakening process, but it helps you consciously participate in your own rebirth instead of feeling like a victim of it. Jung believed that the goal of individuation wasn't to become perfect, but to become whole. Wholeness includes your light and your shadow, your strength and your vulnerability, your clarity and your confusion. When you stop trying to be anything other than exactly what you are in each moment, you discover what he called the self, not the ego self, but the authentic self that was always there, waiting beneath the conditioning. As this integration deepens, you'll notice something remarkable. The world hasn't changed, but your perception of it has. The same situations that once triggered you now feel neutral. The people who once controlled your emotional state no longer have that power. Not because you've become cold or detached, but because you've found your center. You realize that your awakening was never about escaping the human experience. It was about inhabiting it fully, consciously, authentically. The hell you walked through wasn't a punishment. It was an initiation. And now you carry the medicine of that initiation wherever you go. If your spiritual awakening has felt like hell, now you know why. You've been dying to everything that isn't real so you can be born into everything that is. You've been meeting your shadow so you can reclaim your power. You've been losing your mind so you can find your soul. This isn't a comfortable process. It was never meant to be. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But that privilege comes with a price. You have to let go of who you thought you were supposed to be. The hell phase doesn't last forever, but the integration does. Every day you get to choose. Will you abandon yourself to fit in, or will you honor yourself and trust that the right people will find you? Will you numb the discomfort, or will you let it teach you? Will you go back to sleep, or will you stay awake? If this video has spoken to something deep in your soul, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And leave a comment below telling me, what part of your old self are you ready to release? What truth are you ready to embrace? Your awakening isn't happening to you. It's happening through you, for you, and ultimately, as you. Trust the process. Trust the fire. Trust yourself. The hell you're walking through is holy ground.